6 miles above Berlin on a clear March morning, a formation of American heavy bombers glinted in the sun. White contrails stitched the sky. Below, the city lay in neat blocks and avenues, the Reichstag and the Tiergarten shrinking into patterns under the bomber's shadow. A B-17 shuddered as an anti-aircraft shell exploded nearby, peppering the fuselage with shrapnel. Inside the cockpit, men checked instruments, exchanged terse reports, and held to the steady beat required by precision daylight bombing. From that height, the message was simple and unavoidable. Allied bombers could reach Berlin in full daylight, and everyone who looked up could see them. That sight, not merely the destruction they carried, but the fact that they were plainly visible by day over Hitler's capital, did more than degrade factories. It punctured a central myth of Nazi power, the promise made publicly by Reich's Marshal Hermann Göring in August 1939 that no enemy bomber would ever reach Berlin. Seeing the bombers overhead turned an abstract threat into an undeniable reality. What Hitler did when he realized the air over his capital belonged, at least periodically and visibly, to his enemies, was not a single decisive order or a sudden change of policy. It was a series of reactions: denial, fury, a search for scapegoats, a retreat into promises of new weapons, that together exposed a leadership unmoored by an obvious failure of air defense. If you want more detailed World War II explainers like this, subscribe. The promise that no bomber would reach Berlin was more than bravado. In 1939, the Luftwaffe's early victories and the aura of German air power had become foundational to Nazi confidence. Göring's boast functioned politically and psychologically. It reinforced the regime's assurance of protection and played a part in shaping civil expectations about war and security. Early in the conflict, the Reich's air defenses and the Luftwaffe's reputation seemed to justify that confidence. But war changes, and by 1940, the nightly raids of the Royal Air Force began to erode the neatness of the narrative. Night bombing presented a particular political problem and a particular operational reality. Bombers flying over German cities at night could inflict damage and casualties, but the darkness also offered a kind of buffer to public perception. Damage could be presented as isolated, as caused by terror raids, and propaganda could still claim strength and control. As the RAF's campaign intensified through 1940 and into the later Battle of Berlin, not to be confused with the final battle of 1945, the noise of anti-aircraft warnings and blackout curtains became a feature of German urban life. The state adapted its language. Losses were framed, enemies were demonized, and a narrative of endurance took root. What altered the psychological balance, however, was not darkness, but visibility. The United States Army Air Forces developed and refined a doctrine of daylight precision bombing, underpinned by groups of B-17s and B-24s flying in tight formations to concentrate defensive fire, while relying on accuracy to strike industrial targets. The arrival of long-range fighter escorts, especially the P-51 Mustang, once it had the range to accompany the bombers deep into German airspace, reduced bomber losses and allowed sustained strikes in daylight. The result was a simple, brutal fact. Allied aircraft came in numbers during the day, and ordinary Germans could see them. In early March 1944, this pivot became unmistakable. Between March 4th and March 6th, the 8th Air Force mounted large daylight operations against Berlin and the surrounding industrial network. Estimates vary, but these raids involved several hundred heavy bombers with fighter escorts, flying in clear conditions that made them visible across the city and its suburbs. Anti-aircraft batteries sprayed flak into the sky. From the ground, the bomb's distant detonations were followed by a peculiar, helpless clarity.
People knew who had been overhead and when. For the Luftwaffe and for those in Hitler's circle, the impact was twofold. Tactically, the Luftwaffe struggled to produce enough capable interceptors and trained crews to contest the skies effectively. Operational attrition had eaten away experienced pilots. Training programs could not replace the losses at the pace the Allies were inflicting them. Fuel shortages compounded the problem. Allied strategic bombing increasingly struck synthetic oil plants and fuel distribution centers, targets chosen precisely to hamstring German mobility and the Luftwaffe's ability to field sustained sorties. Armament production, Albert Speer later observed, was under constant pressure. Factories sometimes produced numbers that looked adequate on paper, but translating those figures into operational squadrons was constrained by fuel, by trained personnel, and by the slow attrition of maintenance and materiel. These technical and logistical failures mattered, but the deeper blow was symbolic. Göring's public assurance had been a promise to the German people and to Hitler personally. Witnesses and memoirs record a pattern of reactions in the senior leadership as daylight raids multiplied. Initially, there was denial. Intelligence reports were questioned. Data that indicated the scale of the problem were treated as exaggerations. When the evidence could no longer be ignored, the leadership cycle moved into fury, an outward search for culpability. Göring, as head of the Luftwaffe and holder of that 1939 promise, became an obvious target for blame. Accounts vary in detail, but the core is consistent. Hitler alternated between blaming his subordinates and retreating into a rhetoric of miracle weapons.
Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's general of fighter forces, and Albert Speer both described episodes in which Hitler demanded quick fixes or sank into silence when confronted with operational realities. Speer later recalled meetings where the Führer's reactions ranged from rage to a kind of stunned resignation. Galland and others reported that Hitler continued to pin hope on weapons still under development, jets, rockets, and secret wonder weapons that, in his mind, might yet turn the tide. Those hopes functioned politically. They provided a narrative of future triumph, even as the present crumbled. But militarily, they were a diversion from the immediate practical needs of defense. The living evidence of this failure mattered in ways that numbers alone do not capture. A Berlin civilian could look up at mid-afternoon and count the contrails. A streetcar driver, an office clerk, a mother pulling a child out of a shelter, all could see that bombers were real and present. Joseph Goebbels' diary entries from this period reflect a growing tension between official statements and lived experience. The propaganda apparatus tried to maintain morale and the fiction of control, but when the population could witness the enemy overhead, the chasm between messaging and reality widened. The regime's ability to shape perception depended on controlling what people saw. Daylight raids rendered that control more brittle. To understand the strategic mechanics behind that visible presence, one must consider the interplay of bomber tactics, fighter escort, and target selection. American doctrine emphasized formations and bombing accuracy. B-17s and B-24s, with bomb bays full and gunners manning their positions, flew to designated industrial targets with routes that were plotted to maximize survivability and effectiveness. The P-51 Mustang's extended range transformed those missions. Once escorted, the bombers' casualty rates dropped, and the feasibility of deep penetration into German airspace increased. Meanwhile, the 8th Air Force's targeting strategy increasingly focused on oil production, transportation nodes, and the factories that kept the Wehrmacht running. Hitting synthetic fuel plants was not merely about tanks and planes, it was about the system that sustained them.
The Luftwaffe's response was hampered by several interlocking realities. Pilot experience was a critical constraint. Years of combat had sharpened the skills of veteran pilots, but it had also consumed them. The training pipeline could not produce replacements of equivalent quality quickly enough. Aircraft production, while substantial, could not compensate for the combined attrition of pilots, maintenance crews, and fuel.
Speer's post-war analysis emphasized the limits of industrial substitution under strategic bombing pressure. Outputs could be raised in certain sectors, but if the inputs required to transform those outputs into combat power were missing, especially fuel and trained personnel, production numbers became less operationally meaningful. Tactically, the Luftwaffe tried to intercept bomber formations with combinations of fighters and concentrated flak. Sometimes they inflicted heavy losses. In other moments, the combination of escort fighters and the sheer mass of incoming American formations proved too much. Anti-aircraft batteries could burst into the bomber stream, and flak did bring down aircraft, but proximity and timing mattered. A flak burst close enough to riddle a fuselage with shrapnel could send a bomber out of formation. It rarely stopped the larger operation when hundreds of planes were on target. As raids intensified through March and into April 1944, and throughout 1944 generally, the psychological pressure mounted. Hitler's responses, public and private, evolved predictably. Initially, official communiques played down the damage and framed raids as evidence of enemy desperation. When that framing failed, the finger of blame found Göring and the Luftwaffe. According to contemporaneous memoirs and post-war recollections, Hitler publicly and privately demanded explanations and solutions, while privately lashing out at those he saw as responsible. The attacks on German industrial capacity and the visibility of the raids undermined more than factories. They corroded the credibility of the very assurances that had underpinned national confidence. This pattern reached a symbolic apex near the end of the war. Even as the front collapsed on multiple axes and Soviet forces closed in from the east, Allied air power continued to assert itself. One of the final, strangest ironies came in April 1945. On April 20, Hitler's birthday, Allied aircraft again struck Berlin and its environs. The occasion was heavy with symbolic resonance. For the Führer, who had long used pageantry and spectacle to project authority, the fact that the enemy could fly over Berlin on the anniversary of his birth was a stinging public humiliation. Accounts from those last weeks suggest that Hitler's capacity to process such blows narrowed. Fury gave way to a withdrawal into private fantasies and a brittle insistence that ultimate victory remained possible if only certain technologies could be deployed. Those final raids did not cause Hitler's death by themselves. 10 days after the April 20 strikes, on April 30th, Hitler committed suicide as Soviet troops pressed into the city center. Yet the ongoing daytime presence of Allied bombers had helped create the conditions that made the regime's symbolic infrastructure unsustainable. The myth of invulnerability had been public. Its collapse had to be public as well.
Seeing is believing, and when the German people could see the enemy over their capital in daylight, the psychological scaffolding of Nazi certainty began to fall. Micro-vignettes helped to make the scale of this shift feel human. In the forward fuselage of a B-17, Second Lieutenant Robert Johnson, a young pilot whose crew had seen months of missions, later described the peculiar clarity of flying over Berlin in the day. The monotony of instrument checks and navigational corrections was punctuated by the sight of the city opening up beneath them, a model of streets and rooftops that could be measured against intelligence photographs, that could be matched with the names of factories and rail yards on a target list. For Johnson, the knowledge that the mission would be visible to those below carried an odd moral weight. This was precision bombing, and men on the ground would understand who had flown over them. On the streets of Berlin, a clerk named Anna, an archetype of the urban civilian experience recorded in diaries and recollections of the period, would later tell friends that the day she looked up and saw the line of bombers, she no longer accepted official reassurances. Previously, blackout curtains and government statements had been enough to sustain a belief in protection. Now, contrails drew a straight line between policy and consequence. People began to question how a state that could not stop daylight bombers could guarantee anything it claimed to secure. These human moments were reinforced by strategic consequences. With fuel production impaired by targeted bombing and with trained pilots in shorter supply, the Luftwaffe's capacity to mount sustained mass interceptions declined. Production figures, even when impressive in absolute terms, could not be converted into the force required to regain air superiority. This was a point Speer emphasized when discussing industrial output versus the realities of sustaining combat operations. Gallen's memoirs and reports similarly underline the operational strain. Even competent tactics confronted a structural shortage. The regime's propaganda machinery tried to adapt, but propaganda depends on plausibility as much as repetition. When nightly broadcasts and posters promised security, but overhead people's skies were crossed by enemy formations, the rhetorical gap widened into a political problem. Goebbels' diaries record an increasing awareness among Nazi propagandists that the old narratives were losing traction. The cumulative effect was not an instantaneous collapse, but a steady erosion, confidence drained from the same institutions that had once been the regime's strongest pillars. There is an important caution in assessing causality. Strategic bombing did not alone topple the Third Reich. Ground offensives, logistical collapse, political fractures, and the Red Army's approach all combined to bring about Germany's defeat.
But strategic bombardment, especially when it was visible and daylit, performed a distinct function. It severed a symbolic tie between regime claims and everyday experience. It converted a public promise, a vow of protection made in 1939, into a demonstrable failure. That symbolic unraveling changed how decisions were made at the top, how civilians related to leadership, and how the regime projected invulnerability to allies and enemies alike. What Hitler did in response to that realization was telling. He sought explanations, sometimes in the form of reports. He blamed subordinates, notably Göring and the Luftwaffe. He demanded impossible remedies, and increasingly, he retreated into assurances about weapons that were either unavailable or incapable of reversing the fundamental strategic disadvantages Germany faced. His shifts in mood and strategy are documented through the diaries and memoirs of those close to him. Speer's observations of meetings that oscillated between rage and silence. Gallen's reports of despair in the face of operational limits, and Goebbels' notes on a public growing harder to persuade. The image of the bombers overhead remained a quiet, relentless testimony. For those in the bunker listening to reports, for the commanders counting lost sorties, and for the citizens scanning the bright midday sky, the visible presence of Allied air power was an argument that required no words. It demonstrated that the protective promise had failed. It exposed the gap between propaganda and reality. And in exposing that gap, it helped to unravel a central pillar of Nazi legitimacy. When historians look back at the air war over Germany, they track tonnage, sortie counts, production figures, and loss ratios. Those metrics matter. But the story suggested by what Hitler did when he realized American bombers were always above Berlin is a reminder that warfare operates as much in minds as it does in factories. The psychological repercussions of daylight bombing, the fact that the assault could be witnessed, counted, and borne in memory, amplified the physical damage. That amplification helped turn military setbacks into political collapse. In the final analysis, Hitler's response was not a single dramatic act, but a pattern, an attempt to deny, then to displace blame, then to insist on miraculous remedies, and finally to withdraw. Those moves reveal a leader who could not reconcile a public promise with the visible evidence of failure. The bombers did not only break windows and crumple roofs, they broke a promise on which much of the regime's authority had been built. For those who search for a lesson beyond the specifics of April 1945 or March 1944, there is one that emerges clearly. Legitimacy rooted in spectacle and asserted guarantees is vulnerable when reality becomes plainly observable. In Berlin's case, daylight visibility of enemy power exposed that vulnerability in irreversible ways. The Allies' aircraft brought not only explosives, but proof. And proof, when seen by enough people in daylight, can be as decisive as any military maneuver. For more on the air war and its political consequences, subscribe and check our other videos exploring strategic bombing, civilian experience, and the final months of the Third Reich.